The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
For decades, the story of ABBA has been told in sequins and stadium lights. For figures on a stage, voices blending into something the world couldn't resist. The hits came fast, the fame grew enormous, and the image stayed polished. But underneath all of it, beneath the synchronized costumes, the sold-out tours, the platinum records, there was a quieter story, a story that belonged to one man in particular, a man who stood slightly back in the center, who rarely gave long interviews, and who let the music speak in ways he himself could not. That man is Benny Andersson. And now, at 78 years old, he is finally speaking, not in grand gestures or dramatic confessions. That was never his way, but in the careful, measured words of a man who has had decades to sit with the truth and has finally decided that the world deserves to hear it. What he confirms is not scandalous in the traditional sense. There are no shocking betrayals or hidden secrets in the tabloid meaning of the phrase. What Benny confirms is something far more resonant. That ABBA, one of the most beloved musical acts in human history, was built not on happiness, but on the raw, trembling material of human pain. To understand Benny Andersson at 78, you have to go back much further. Back to a boy in Sweden who grew up surrounded not by pop music or the sound of commercial radio, but by folk melodies, church harmonies, and the warm drone of the accordion. Music, for the young Benny, was never entertainment. It was a language. The only language, in many ways, that made complete sense to him. He was not a naturally expressive child in a conventional way. He did not pour his feelings into conversation or seek out emotional confrontation. Instead, he learned early that a chord could say what words refused to. A minor key could hold grief that he couldn't articulate. A sudden shift in harmony could express the complicated tension of something unresolved. By the time he was a young man, Benny had developed a relationship with music that was deeply personal, almost private, in a way that would eventually define ABBA's sound and quietly complicate his life. When ABBA formed and began its ascent, the world quickly fell in love with the two women at the front. Agnetha and Frida were magnetic, beautiful, emotive performers who drew every camera in the room. Benny and Björn Ulvaeus were understood to be the architects, the craftsmen behind the scenes. And while that framing wasn't wrong, it was deeply incomplete. Björn brought the words. Benny brought the soul. Every chord progression, every carefully placed pause, every moment of tension before a melody resolved. That was Benny. He wasn't decorating songs. He was building emotional architecture. He was constructing the invisible scaffolding that made people feel things they couldn't explain when an ABBA song came on. The joy that felt slightly melancholy. The dancing that somehow made you want to cry. That contradiction was not accidental. That was Benny's fingerprint, pressed into every track. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being essential but unseen. Benny Andersson lived inside that loneliness for years. When ABBA swept across the globe, the coverage was relentless and largely focused on the women, their personal lives, their fashion choices, their vocal performances. Benny watched from the control room, from behind the glass, from the back of the stage. He was not bitter toward his bandmates. He has been clear about that. His frustration was directed at something harder to name, a world that reduced his contributions to the category of technical support, while the emotional depth he poured into those songs went largely unnoticed. He was described in interviews and profiles as cold, calculating, the brain of the operation, as opposed to the heart. This characterization stung in ways he rarely admitted publicly, because it was precisely backwards. Benny was the most emotionally invested person in that studio. He just expressed emotion differently from the way the world expected. He expressed it through music, not through tears or outbursts or press interviews. And because he kept his personal feelings to himself, the world assumed he didn't have any. The irony is profound. The man most responsible for making ABBA's music emotionally resonant was consistently labeled as the unemotional one. While fans wept at concerts and critics praised the singer's raw delivery, Benny stood quietly and watched. He knew where those feelings had come from. He had planted them there, bar by bar, carefully, deliberately, but the credit rarely followed the source. In recent conversations, Benny has started to address this openly. He speaks about it not with anger, but with the calm clarity of someone who has long since made peace with injustice while still acknowledging that it was real. He wanted more than fame, for people to understand what the music actually cost him, that it was not produced by technical skill alone, but by a man who put his most private interior life into every arrangement. The relationship between Benny and Annie Frid Lyngstad, known to the world as Frida, was one of the most significant of his life. It was also one of the most complicated. They came together through music, and music both sustained them and ultimately exposed the gap between them. Frida was expressive, warm, and emotionally present in a way that some people simply are, people who feel things loudly and need their feelings acknowledged in return. Benny was the opposite, not cold, not indifferent, but deeply internal. When emotions rose, his instinct was not to speak, but to sit at the piano, to find a feeling in a chord, and let that stand as his response. This worked magnificently in the studio. Their differences in temperament produced music of extraordinary range. Frida's expressive delivery, riding over Benny's carefully constructed emotional landscapes in ways that moved millions of people. But what worked creatively did not translate to what their relationship needed outside of work. Frida needed someone who could sit with her in the ordinary spaces of life and be present. Someone who could hold a difficult conversation instead of retreating into composition. Benny, by his own admission, was not capable of that at the time. It was not that he didn't care. It was that vulnerability outside the context of music felt genuinely dangerous to him. Music gave him control over how much of himself he revealed. Real-life emotional conversation did not offer that protection. Some of ABBA's most enduring and heartbreaking songs emerged from this period. Songs that explored abandonment, loss, the bittersweet aftermath of love, and the quiet devastation of two people failing each other despite their best intentions. Benny has confirmed what many always suspected. Those songs were not merely professional exercises in pop songwriting. They were his way of processing something he couldn't bring himself to address directly. He wrote his guilt into the music. He composed his way through pain instead of living through it. The confession he made in a recent reflection, that he gave his best and most honest lines to songs rather than to the people who needed to hear them in person, is perhaps the most quietly devastating thing he has ever said. It reframes the entire catalog. Every aching melody becomes not just a great pop song, but evidence of a man who found it safer to be honest with the world than with the person sitting across from him. As the 1970s turned into the 1980s, the cracks inside ABBA grew harder to ignore. The world still saw a glamorous, successful group delivering hit after hit. What the world did not see was the internal exhaustion, creative, emotional, and personal, that was quietly consuming the people inside that image. The marriages at the center of ABBA were dissolving. Benny and Frida's relationship had run its painful course. Bjorn and Agnetha's marriage had already ended. For people who had built something extraordinary together were now navigating the wreckage of personal lives, while still being expected to produce joyful, radio-ready pop music. The performance required to maintain that gap between private collapse and public triumph was enormous. Benny speaks now about the latter years of ABBA not with nostalgia, but with something more like sorrow mixed with understanding. He admits that by the time the group wound down, the music had stopped feeling true. This was perhaps the most damning thing that could happen to a man for whom musical honesty was everything. He wasn't creating because he was inspired. He was creating because he felt obligated. Because walking away from the machine ABBA had become felt impossible. Too many people depended on it. Too much had been invested. And Benny's deep sense of responsibility would not allow him to be the one who stopped. So he stayed past the point where staying made creative sense. And the music suffered for it in ways that only he, perhaps, fully recognized. The public still bought the records. But Benny knew the difference between music built from genuine emotion and music produced from duty. He knew when the soul had left the work. And he stayed anyway, because guilt is a powerful anchor. The end, when it finally came, was not dramatic. There was no famous argument, no public fallout, no single moment that history could point to as the breaking point. It simply stopped. People drifted in different directions. The silence that followed was vast and, for Benny, strangely harder to process than the chaos that preceded it. After ABBA, Benny retreated. Not dramatically, not into seclusion, but into quieter creative spaces where the pressure maintaining a global pop phenomenon no longer existed. He turned to theater, to orchestral work, to film scoring. He composed musicals that allowed him to explore emotional complexity without the commercial machinery of the pop world bearing down on him. This period was, by his own account, a form of healing, the work he produced during these years. Scores and musicals that drew on folk traditions, classical influences, and operatic scale allowed him to reconnect with the reasons he had loved music in the first place. Before fame, before ABBA, before the complicated entanglement of art and personal life and public expectation. He also, reportedly, did something very private during this period. He kept a journal. In it, he wrote letters he never sent, to Frida, to Agnetha, to Bjorn. In those pages, he said the things he had been unable to say during the years when it might have mattered. It was belated and he knew it, but it was honest. And honesty, even belated, has its own value. What Benny discovered in his post-ABBA years was something he had perhaps always known intellectually but needed time to truly feel. That music created purely for the love of creation, without the weight of commercial obligation or personal entanglement, could be a genuinely joyful act. He began to remember what it felt like to write music, because he wanted to, not because he had to. In recent years, Benny has taken on a role that might surprise people who only know him as a quiet one at the keyboard. He has become a mentor, not in the formal sense of a school or program, but in the organic way that sometimes happens when an older artist recognizes something in a younger one and decides to offer what wisdom they have. His mentorship is not primarily technical, though he has plenty of technical knowledge to share. What Benny emphasizes by the accounts of those who have spoken with him is emotional honesty. He talks about the difference between music that is technically accomplished and music that is true. He talks about the cost of using art as a substitute for living, and the importance of not hiding inside your work when the world outside it needs your presence. This is Benny passing on the lesson he learned the hard way. He built an extraordinary body of work by pouring his most private self into music instead of into his relationships. The music is extraordinary. The cost was real. He wants younger artists to understand that the goal is not to choose between the work and the life, but to find a way to inhabit both honestly.